Good morning. It's great to have each one here. Thank you for being part of worship this morning, and happy Mother's Day. So last week we continued on in our journey in the book of Ruth and continued on in verse number 1, where we discovered this beautiful story began in a season of famine. And we've really been looking at and considering how we react to times of famine in our lives. This season of famine was more than an agricultural crisis. It was a spiritual alarm. It was God's way of getting the nation's attention. Through the famine, he was calling them back to himself. The famine is really where the deliverance began. In times of famine in our lives is where God starts to do his work in us. Seasons of famine, seasons of pressure, seasons of fear, and seasons of uncertainty, like that of the lives of the children of Israel, expose what we truly believe about God. Because it's easy to say it with the lips, but what is in the heart and what we truly believe comes out through the actions. And we saw that through the children of Israel. When the time of famine came, when the oppressing nations came down through the nations to take over Israel, Israel hid in caves when they should have run to God. Elimelech ran to Moab when he should have stayed in Bethlehem. Seasons of famine in our lives then are crossroads moments. They force a decision. They expose the heart, and they reveal what we truly believe about God. Today, as we move deeper into the story, we're going to look at Elimelech's family. And we're going to see how their names, their decisions, and the direction that their lives took preach a sermon all of their own. In the book of Ruth, nothing is accidental. Not the famine, not the geography, and not even the names of the characters. Each detail reveals something about the human heart and something about the God who redeems broken lives. Let's return to our text this morning. Let's look at verse number 1. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. And the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi. And the name of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they came into the country of Moab and continued there. With the famine, the pressure, and the drift as the backdrop to the book of Ruth, we now meet the people themselves. This is where the story becomes personal. Because Scripture doesn't just tell us what happened, it introduces us to the people who lived through it. And in Ruth, even the names aren't random. Elimelech, Naomi, Mahlon, Chilion, they all preach a message. Because in the Hebrew, names often carried meaning, often carried messages, and sometimes even warnings. So in Ruth, the names of the family are not just simply labels. They are windows into the heart of the family, clues to the spiritual condition, and signposts pointing to the choices that they made in a time of famine. And the names tell us much more than we may expect. So let's look at each of these names individually. In verse number 2, the name of the man was Elimelech. Now, the first name that we're introduced to is Elimelech, who is the father, the husband, and the spiritual leader of the home. And we touched on this last week. Elimelech's name means, my God is king. And yet, we saw how his actions, how his lifestyle denied that truth in his life. His actions did not show or demonstrate that God was king in his life. Much like the actions and decisions in our lives can sometimes show that God is not king in our lives. You see, if God is king in your life, then you stay where God has placed you. If God is king in your life, then you trust him during the times of famine, during the times of hardship. If God is king, then we don't run to our own Moab for help. Elimelech demonstrated through his decisions and actions that it is possible to say with your lips, God is king, but live as though you are the king of your own life. Many believers today carry the right confession, but still make the wrong decisions. We say God is king, but when the famine hits, when the hardships hit, we take control. We run to our own Moab. We trust our own plans, and we lean into our own understanding. Elimelech warns us that our theology means nothing if our decisions, if our actions contradict the reality that God is king. The second person that we're introduced to is Naomi, Elimelech's wife. Naomi means pleasant, it means sweet, and it means delightful. Now it pictures the life that God intended for his people in the land of promise. I was talking with Hannah this weekend, and the church that she attends, they've just been going through the book of Judges. And we were talking about the cycles of sin and going into bondage and God delivering them. That was never what God intended for his children. He promised them a land that flowed with milk and honey, a land of blessings. But you remember, he also gave them a choice. Choose life or death, good or evil, feast or famine. And Israel just kept choosing evil and wrong and famine. Naomi means pleasant, sweet, and delightful, and that's what God promised the people. But famine has a way of testing the soul, and Moab has a way of draining what the famine exposes. By the time Naomi returns back to Israel, back from the land of Moab, and she meets her friends and family, she says to them, "Call me not Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty hath dealt bitterly with me." Mara here means bitter. It's the complete opposite to what Naomi means. Her name reflected who she was, but her change of name to bitterness reflected who she had become through the famine, through the loss of her husband and her children, and through the consequences of leaving Bethlehem. Seasons of famine, loss, and the consequence of poor decision-making can often distort how we see ourselves and how we see our relationship with God. Like Naomi, we can start to label ourselves not by who we truly are, and we are accepted in the beloved, but how we feel in a given moment, or how we interpret the circumstances around us. And the reality is those labels have nothing to do with how God sees us. Those names that we call ourselves have nothing to do with how God sees us. When the hardships come, when the famine times come, we start to label ourselves. We start to call ourselves Mara, just like Naomi. We say things like, well, I'm worthless. I'm useless. I'm unworthy. I'm unappreciated. I'm empty. I'm forgotten. I'm broken. Yet that's not how God sees us. You see, the beauty about Naomi's story is that God never refers to her as Mara. And God never calls you by your labels either. He calls you by the names He's given you. We're called as sons and daughters. We're called beloved and accepted. Not the names that our pain tries to give us. God refuses to rename us based upon our painful seasons, just as He refused to address Naomi by her name, bitterness, that she gave herself. He kept calling her Naomi, pleasant, sweet, delightful, because God could see her future and not just her feelings. He saw her restoration and not just her ruin. He saw her redemption and not just her regret. And that's what we've got to keep in mind. God sees tomorrow. We don't. We see today. Naomi reminds us that seasons of famine and the consequences of poor choices may change how we feel, but they do not change who we are in the eyes of God. When Naomi said, "Call me Mara," God said to her, "You are beloved, not bitter. You are chosen, not forgotten. You are redeemed, not ruined. You are mine. You are not abandoned. You are new and not defined by your past." From Naomi, we learn not to rename ourselves based on temporary seasons. This famine is not the whole story, it is just a chapter. And just as God wasn't finished with Naomi, when we face times of famine, it doesn't mean that God is finished with us either. Look at verse 2 again. We're introduced to Elimelech and Naomi's sons. And the name of the two sons were Mahlon and Chilion. Mahlon means sickly or weak. Great name. Grace, you can cross that name off your list of potential names for my grandbaby. You can also cross off Chilion, because that means wasting away or failing. So what's important that we need to understand in these names is they were given to the sons before they left Bethlehem. So their names are not a reaction to Elimelech going to Moab, but they're woven into the story long before they made the move. Now, as I said, in Hebrew culture, names often carry layers of meaning. They talk about identity. Sometimes they have a message, and sometimes even a warning. That's why the names of Elimelech's sons raise an important question. Well, at least they did in my mind. I was asking myself, well, if they were named as babies before they left, what do these names mean? Are they prophetic? Are they a warning? Are they a description of their physical condition? Or are they something entirely different? The answer, I believe, is that their names and the meanings of their names operate on multiple levels. Firstly, I think the names do likely describe their physical condition. Mahlon and Chilion most likely reflect their physical frailty at birth and ongoing weaknesses. The names give us a glimpse of a family that was already dealing with health challenges. Challenges that were intensified by the famine and further complicated by their move from Bethlehem to Moab. Now, there are seasons when in our lives when our faith feels thin, when it feels frail, when it feels weak. And it's in those moments that famine can tempt us to make decisions rooted in fear rather than in trusting the Lord. Because it's in those times when our faith is frail, when our faith is weak, that we stop abiding in God and we start to abide in our own strength. That's when we stop waiting on God and start trusting in our own abilities. And it's during those times that we stop trusting God and start doing our own thing. It's when we decide the exit to Moab looks really good about now. It's when our faith is weak that we start to grasp for solutions outside of God's provision. Just as Elimelech left Bethlehem for Moab, we drift from the place of God's presence towards the place of promised relief that never, ever gets fulfilled. Because that's what Moab promised to Elimelech. relief, but it gave him nothing but. Secondly, I think their names also function as a narrative foreshadowing future events. Even if the parents name them based on physical conditions, their names are used to foreshadow their fate. Mylon means sickly and he dies. Chilion, wasting away, dies as well. The names became a signal that life outside of God will lead to decline and not strength. Now, frailty is not sin. God is gentle with the weak. But when frailty leads us away from God instead of towards Him, then the decline starts. And it picks up momentum and it happens a lot faster. Folks, I've seen this in my life, and I've seen it in the lives of those that leave Bethlehem for Moab. I guess what I'm saying is, it's when people start to look out into the world and think the grass is greener on the other side, and often it ain't. And that's kind of what happened here with Elimelech. The grass looked greener on the other side, but when he got there, it was just further heartache because he died and his sons died. Mylon and Chilion's names show us what that frailty looks like. The deaths show us what fleeing from God can lead to. And in their lives, pattern our lives, because decline often follows distance from God. And we need to remind ourselves that weakness is not our destiny, that famine is not our future, and that abiding in God, abiding in Jesus Christ is our lifeline. And that's why it was important for Elimelech and his family to remain, to abide where God's presence was. Thirdly, their names serve as a warning about Elimelech's decision. Although the boys were named before the move, their names became a commentary on the family's spiritual condition. Think of the pattern. Elimelech, my God is king, does not live like God is king. Naomi, which means pleasant, becomes bitter. And Mylon, sickly, and Chilion, wasting away, die in Moab. The names form a sobering picture. A family spiritually weakened in Bethlehem becomes physically exhausted in Moab. The names warn us that spiritual drift leads to spiritual weakness. Spiritual weakness leads to poor decisions, and poor decisions lead to painful consequences. The boys' names were not the cause of their death. It wasn't like they were cursed by their names, but they were a symbol of the family's condition. So what do we do with the names? What do these names mean for us? Well, Mylon and Chilion remind us that weakness often begins long before the crisis. They were frail before the famine, just as spiritual drift often begins quietly long before the hardship hits. We need to remind ourselves that running from God never strengthens us. Moab didn't heal what was weak, it magnified it. Small compromises today can lead to major consequences tomorrow. The famine wasn't the problem. Staying in Moab was. God wants to strengthen what is weak before it collapses. Their names call us to return to God before weakness becomes our ruin. Their names carry layers of meaning that invite us to reflect on our own seasons of famine, our own seasons of hardship, and how we respond to them. But there's two other words that are kind of important in these first two verses, and I want to look at those a little bit because they really give us a clue as to what's going on. Verse 1 says, "Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. And the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi. And the name of his 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they came to the country of Moab and continued there." Now, if the clicker was working, I would have clicked to the next slide, and the 2 words would have, keep going, and the 2 words would be highlighted. The 2 words are sojourn in verse number 1 and continue in verse number 2. Sojourn is the Hebrew word ger. And ger means to live temporarily, to dwell as a foreigner, and to stay as a resident alien. It's to be somewhere, to live somewhere, not as a citizen, but as a guest. Hamish and Hannah are sojourning with me and Tracy this weekend. They are our guests. So it carries the idea of temporary relocation, not permanent settlement. It's like someone saying, we're going to go there for a little while and just until things get better. The second word is continued, which is higher. And continue means to remain, to stay, to be settled, and to take up residency. The idea is that what began as a temporary stay becomes a long-term decision to stay. Elimelech went to Moab for a little while, but in verse 2 it says he stayed. He became settled. He remained. He took up residence. The shift from sojourn to continued is a subtle but devastating shift. It reveals the quiet drift of a heart under pressure. Elimelech didn't plan to leave God's land forever. He simply planned to leave for now, but somewhere along the way, for now became forever. For now became for good. And that's how spiritual drift works in our lives. We rarely run from God in one big step. We drift in small steps. We go from sojourning to continuing. Pressure creates, the famine creates the pressure creates fear, and fear creates a desire for escape. So Elimelech says, let's just go to Moab until the famine passes. But the famine decisions are dangerous decisions. Because when we run from God's place in a moment of pressure, we often end up staying longer in Moab than we ever intended. So Elimelech left Bethlehem to sojourn, but ended up continuing in Moab. And Moab became the place where he died. Moab became the place where his sons died. And Moab became the place where Naomi became empty. And when she became empty, she became bitter. Temporary disobedience can often become long-term consequences because of the shift between sojourn and continuing. How do these words speak to us this morning? Well, we often sojourn in places that God never intended us to live. We often sojourn in Moab, the Moab of our making, where God never intended us to live. And we justify it by saying things like, it's just for a season. It's just till things calm down. It's just until I feel better. It's just until the pressure lifts. But temporary compromises today become permanent patterns tomorrow. Small steps away from God become big distances over time. No one plans to drift. No one plans to cool spiritually in their relationship with God. No one plans to end up far from God. But like we always say, A journey of 1,000 steps starts with the first step. And the first step is to sojourn. We simply sojourn. We simply move. And before long, we've taken up residency in Moab. Thirdly, famine moments test whether we will run to God or run from God. When life gets hard, we will either stay in Bethlehem, trust God in the famine, or run to Moab, which is where we seek our own solutions. And when we run to Moab, we run with the concept of sojourning. This is temporary, just until this crisis. And then I'll be right back, God. I'll be faithful. But it doesn't happen. And the place that we run to in famine becomes the place that we stay. Fourthly, God calls us back before sojourning becomes continuing. The moment we realize we've drifted, God invites us to return. Naomi eventually comes back with Ruth, and we will get there. And God meets her there. Elimelech went to Moab to sojourn just for a little while. But he ended up continuing there, and he ended up dying there. And that is the danger of the famine decisions. What begins as temporary relief can become long-term ruin. But God still calls us to come back to him. The book of Judges proves that with the nation of Israel. Every time they turned away and they cried out to God, God responded and raised up a judge, and they were delivered out of their bondage. The moment we've realized that we've gone from sojourning to remaining is the time that we need to turn back to God. Ruth begins with famine, but as we will see, it doesn't end there. It begins with a family drifting, but it does not end in their drift. It begins with names that speak of weakness and bitterness and misplaced trust. But it ends with a God who writes redemption in the very places where his people have wandered. Elimelech's name told us that he should have believed that God is king. Naomi's name told us what she was meant to be, pleasant and sweet and delightful. Mahlon and Chilion's name told us what the family had become, weak and frail and wasting away. And then these two Hebrew words told us the rest of the story. Elimelech went to Moab to sojourn just for a little while, but he continued there. What began as temporary became permanent. What began as survival became surrender. And what became as small steps became a settled direction. And that's the warning of Ruth. Famine moments reveal the heart. And famine decisions will shape our future. Elimelech teaches us that fear can dethrone God that we claim as king. Naomi teaches us that bitterness can rename us if we let it. Mahlon and Chilion teach us that weakness grows when we run from God instead of to God. The words sojourn and continue teach us that small compromises become long-term consequences. But the book of Ruth, the story contained within Ruth, whispers hope. God never calls Naomi Mara. He never accepts the name her pain gave her. He keeps calling her Naomi because he sees her future and not her famine. And the same is true for you. You may be in a season of famine. You may feel empty and pressured, uncertain and afraid. You may have started to take steps towards your own Moab, a compromise, a shortcut, or an escape route. But God is calling you back before sojourning becomes continuing, before temporary becomes permanent, and before weakness becomes ruin. The famine is not the end of your story. Moab is not the end of your story. And bitterness is not the end of your story. Because the God of Ruth specializes in meeting people in the midst of their famine, calling them home from Moab and restoring what was lost. So the question Ruth leads us with is simple and searching. When famine comes, where will you run? To Moab or to the God who is still king? May we be a people who stay in Bethlehem. May we trust God who names us, not the pain that tries to rename us. And may we still believe that in famine, God is already preparing deliverance for us. I think it's more than all I got.